we should just spend the next 2 years talking about the impact of Minecraft on our industry, and continues to just be incredibly successful. So why don't we spend all our days talking about that? That is what we should be envious of, not the red carpet walk.
What's up, guys? It's Justin Kahn back at it again. We're doing another episode of our podcast, Secret Stash, and I'm here with Archie Stonehill, head of product at Stash. Say hello, Archie.
Hey, everyone. Excited to be doing this again.
And we've got a special guest co-host today. That's my co-founder and life partner, Robin Chan, also gaming industry expert. He couldn't resist the opportunity to dip in with our guest today. They're old friends. And so today I'm super excited to welcome Owen Mahoney to the podcast. Owen's been a longtime game industry veteran. He was the CEO of Nexon. You've probably heard of them. And VP Strategic Partnerships at EA. Hello, Owen. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
So today we'll be diving into the evolution of the games industry through Owen's really, really unique lens based on his incredible career. So we'll start with some of his experiences early on in EA, and where he played like a really key role in their kind of probably golden era for them, and a great era for American games increasingly. And then we'll move on to his time at Nexon, which is what he's most well known for. He led the company through like really tectonic shifts in the industry from 2010 to really kind of very recently. I do want to mention that during his time, Nexon was probably the best performing public games company in the world, and that Robin, who's here, who I'll mention since he's here, did call Owen the best publicly traded gaming CEO of the last 10 years. So we'll cover that and then dig into Owen's thoughts on the current state of the AAA market, all the stuff we normally cover.
Thanks. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. So let's just dive in with like a question that we ask almost everyone, which is how you got started in games. Like what brought you to the gaming world?
Well, yeah, I guess it depends on how far you want to go back. I was a gamer as a kid. I worked at one of the first computer stores in the U.S. Not long after the Byte Shop, which was famously the first real computer store. I worked at a store in downtown San Francisco called Computer Connection, and this really dates me because I'm kind of a fossil. But I was selling games on Apple IIs, and everybody was on commission in those days, and so they didn't want to waste their time learning and playing games. But they hired me and a couple of my friends to sell games, that were on Apple IIs at the time, and I was like 14 or 15, and so I was in heaven. But I quickly realized, since everybody was on commission, that the real money was in selling early spreadsheet systems with printers and that sort of stuff. And it turns out it was actually a pretty good business, and it helped me pay for college. So it worked out well in the end. But my real start in the games industry was I joined Electronic Arts in 2000, which was a really interesting time to join EA. The industry was definitely going through very major tectonic shifts, and I think EA played its hand very well. It was the dawn of the PlayStation 2, which was the first really serious console at the time. It was, Madden Football really took off then. It was right before GTA 3 launched. So it's just a really special time in the industry.
What did EA do right back then? I mean, I think I grew up in that era playing all these EA games. So like from the inside, what was special about EA?
Great question. It didn't always feel like we were doing much right at the time. We were mostly, it was almost a case study in the innovator's dilemma of, hey, we're really good at this one thing, but the world is shifting out from under us, and we have to get good at this other thing. And we really knew how to execute on a packaged goods games business better than anybody else, I think. And none of that I created. It was all there before I got there. But the CEO, Larry Probst, had come out of the sales team. He ran sales before that. He just really knew how to put product through the channel. He had an outstanding group under him. In those days, John Riccatello was the COO. He was the one who actually recruited me into EA. Nancy Smith ran North American sales. David Gardner ran Europe. And Don Matrick and Paul Lee ran the studio. And, it was in some ways kind of a Abraham Lincoln team of rivals. There was a lot of clashing of viewpoints on the world and cultures and thoughts about how to do the business and on strategy. But they really knew how to put product through the channel. They knew how to position it very well. They just were fabulous marketers. And to this day, and it went back farther than that time, but they had branded the company EA Sports for the sports games, and still to this day people call EA Sports because the brand that worked so well. There were other brands that they had, but that was an example of what they did. The other thing to remember in going to your, I know you guys are interested in distribution, but remember in those days, a great game publisher had serious leverage in the channel and serious network effects in the channel. So in 1999, when they launched The Sims, they could launch this brand new franchise of a type that nobody had seen before. I mean, imagine a major AAA game publisher launching something that is completely new and different, like no one had seen before. And how do they pull that off? Well, there are a number of things that they did, but they had leverage in the channel. So they could launch it behind Madden and FIFA, because everybody wanted to get their hands on boxed products. So if you're Target or your Walmart or Best Buy, you just really want to get your hands on products. So you'll give the shelf space to allow them to launch The Sims behind these great big franchises. Today, none of that exists among big publishers, and the channel has sort of grabbed all the leverage in the system.
Right, like now every game has to kind of stand on its own and do UA on its own versus being able to leverage your hits.
Yeah, best case it's sort of it's an even playing field, I think, between an indie game and a massive AAA launch. Best case it's a level playing field. You could argue that the indie game launches have a lot of advantages over a major AAA company. And we've seen that happen. But in those days, I mean, when I think back to the launch of The Sims and how revolutionary that was, again, just the idea you could put a completely new genre. It's like a major AAA game company coming out with Minecraft. Like you would never think that is going to happen today. What you're going to get is an FPS or an RTS or something that looks like something that's already out there. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but I'd say, going back to your question about why EA was so good, they just really knew the channel really well. They were executing beautifully, and also the scale of new game development work was scaled to the size of the company. It's now gotten way beyond the size of the company now, and it's had all sorts of ramifications about creativity in the industry. But in those days, The Sims didn't cost that much for us to develop, and they had a lot of people developing it, but it wasn't anywhere near what the size is of new game development today. So they had a bunch of really good studios, and they managed them well. They did they made a ton of mistakes, but they also managed that stuff really well. And I think that crew that ran it was a very good crew of people.
There is, you mentioned like using Madden as kind of, I guess, like a jump off point to launch a first party IP like The Sims, which is now like one of the most cherished games, original IPs. But I am really interested because, despite some exceptions, the association I have with EA, and I think in some ways this might be true more now than then with some of the Disney partnerships, is that it is a master of licensing. And I'm always really interested in that strategy and, why that seemed to have worked, how that model works then, how that's changed. And then also, if you might touch on, like, if you think that model is still as needed as it was, or like why you think FIFA has been able to continue FC without the FIFA IP.
So it's why is the monster of licensing strategy come about, and why is it sort of the world developed in that way?
Or like, how did licensing work kind of economically or relationships wise at EA back then? And then what your view is on licensing as a strategy today?
Well, I guess you'd have to back up and think a little bit about how the industry has evolved. And it really goes down to development costs. I mean, the short answer to your question is licensing of IP is a great way to differentiate yourself and market yourself in a world that demands differentiation in marketing. It's very hard to differentiate yourself. So if you get the Warhammer IP or the FIFA IP or the Bond IP or, whatever it is, Disney, you have a first-person shooter, let's say, you immediately position yourself differently because people want to be in the Star Wars universe or the Warhammer universe or what have you. And that's very important. It doesn't work particularly well on a bad game, at least over the long term, but on a good game, it really, you could argue that's a very smart strategy. How it came about to that point where there are so many licensed products, I think is directly related to the problems of game development. And that really goes back to development costs. I mean, when
in the old days, right? Like it used to take $10 million to make a game. Before that, it was $100,000. It's gone up on this very steady log curve over the last 15 years, and it's very steady. And we have a graph that we used to show at Nexon Investor Relations that, this was in 2017. I was making the point to a group of people at a conference in London that the table stakes for game development is blown through 100 million, and it's rapidly on its way to 200 million. And by 2023, or it's like 2025, it'll hit $1 billion. And like clockwork, the word on the street is that GTA 6 is going to be $1 billion, and it's launching in 2025. It's actually, possibly more. But I can tell you in 2018, or I think it was 2008, it was right before COVID, so maybe it was 2019, when I gave this slide, like investors really took issue with this slide. They were like, this is not how it's going. And I was like, well, look at all the other game developers or the publishers of size. They think this is a feature, not a bug. They're talking about how, there's returns to scale and the small guys will not be able to survive and so on. They think this is great for their strategy. So, if you don't believe me, look at them. But the people, I think, had a really hard time believing that there was going to be an order of magnitude shift in the price of development over a small period of time that's going to take us to $1 billion in game development. And it's clearly what's been headed. So if that's your framework and you've got to put something out that is really, really huge, and let's say you're a $20, $30 billion company, market cap. I mean, when I left Nexon 9 months ago, we were a $22-ish billion market cap. We had about $6 billion in bank. We did, about $1 billion of operating income. But I can tell you, if I made a $200 million mistake because one of my games didn't work out, it would be a real serious conversation with my board. And then if I had a $300 million, but if I had a couple of those, and they were between 200 and 300 million, they might be calling for my head. And if they weren't calling for my head, certainly there'd be shareholders out there who would want to turf me. So if that's your framework, what do you do if you're sitting in my shoes? Well, you try not to make a mistake, right? And so when you're not making mistakes, suddenly your product development starts to look a lot like everything else, which means you have a not so differentiated product, which means that's a different sales prospect, right? Like now you've got a different marketing problem. And so to get back to your point about licensing, licensing is sort of downstream from this issue of development costs, I think. And so they're very directly related.
What do you think is attributed to the kind of growth in development cost, like the consistent growth in development costs? And then I guess downstream, do you think that's like, have the margins remained fixed? Like the pie's been bigger, the games are just scaling bigger, or has the AAA industry become worse over time?
Well, I've had a million conversations about this over the last decade, and I think I have a viewpoint that a lot of people may disagree with me on. So, feel free to shoot this idea down. It certainly at least has some battle testing. Look, I think a couple of things. Number one is the games industry likes to think of itself. I'm talking about big AAA developers, and nobody specifically. I'm talking overall. I'm not taking aim at any particular person or company.
This is just generic, general to the industry.
But I have noticed that the games industry kind of thinks of itself as the poor man's Hollywood. And, we call our project managers producers. We talk about, there's you could do a buzzword bingo at any E3 event about cinematic graphics and sound. I mean, if you had a drinking game at some of these where you had to take a shot for every time they say cinematic graphics and sound, for any time in the last 15, 20 years, really since the PlayStation 2, you'd be very drunk within about 20 minutes of any one of these presentations. And so I think there's a fixation on trying to look like Hollywood. And I would respectfully submit that we've gone well past the era of the time of diminishing returns. That last polygon on the page doesn't really matter. But yet all the developer tools, right? If you just look at the developer tools, it's all about graphics fidelity. And we do this at the Game Awards show, right? Like a lot of the presentations and the great looking graphics are about that topic. The problem with that approach to life and that sort of fixation on Hollywood style graphics and sound is we don't sell our product doesn't sell based off of the last polygon on the page. Our product sells because it's fun. And especially in the world that I live in of, long-lived online games like the kind that Nexon makes. If you're not coming back 5 or 10 years from now, we consider that a failure, right? So like, it may look flashy for a demo or for 10 minutes of gameplay, but I've got to think about how to bring you back on the 1,000th hour, or 10 years from now. And that goes back to fun. So the industry is fixated on this one topic just based off its own actions and its own words. And yet gamers buy something different. And so I think there's a serious mismatch. But the problem with cinematic graphics and sound is not only is it basically a commodity now, and it's not helping, it's also by far the most expensive cost in your P&L. I mean, if you're going to do a AAA game, you get greenlit for a AAA game, you're going to have to scoop up, 50 environmental artists. And you're going to have to scoop up 10 or 15 sound people, right? And they're expensive. And so, when I was at EA, sort of in the later years that I was in EA, the big solution to this was to outsource a lot of that art and sound generation and some mocap and some other stuff to places like China and Southeast Asia. That has gone away. And so those are some of the reasons why it's gotten so expensive. And I think that the industry is sort of wrapped around an axle on this. And then everybody gets surprised when something that doesn't depend on them at all ends up being a hardcore, what I would argue, a AAA game, something like a League of Legends or a Minecraft. Like, we should just spend the next 2 years talking about the impact of Minecraft on our industry. My kids grew up with it and still to this day play. And I was just visiting my son last week in college. There were like 3 kids in the dorms playing Minecraft, and they're college kids, in engineering school. So I think the industry is focusing on one thing that's the most expensive thing, and that's not the real thing to focus on. So that's my take.
Yeah, I still play Minecraft to this day. I mean, that game means so much to me. It's, as people don't know, by far the best-selling game in video games history, not even close.
Yeah, and I would say it's 2 really important things. It's a beautiful piece of art, by almost any definition of the word art, which is of course hard to define. It's also arguably the highest ROI return of the entire games industry. I mean, it was one guy in his apartment in Stockholm eating top ramen, and continues to just be incredibly successful. So why don't we spend all our days talking about that? That is what we should be envious of, not the red carpet walks in Hollywood.
What do you think that is? Because
nobody in Hollywood will tell you they should be envy of Hollywood. They're all envious of us in the games business because we're all healthy and basically growing. So
yeah.
Sorry, what were you saying, Justin?
I'm surprised. It like Minecraft came out in what, 2008 or something? That's 2007.
No,
maybe.
In alpha, as I recall, it was 2010.
Okay, so it's been a long time, and like League came out in 2009. Like have been these examples of like extremely high ROI games that have competed on a instead of the red ocean of better cinematic graphics and sound, it's been some differentiated gameplay and fun experience, or like amazing piece of art, or with League it was like a differentiated distribution and community. Maybe like, why do you think there's so much momentum around kind of doing what AAA games have been doing since the 90s?
Like why can't we get more games like Minecraft?
Yeah, exactly. Or why are they spending like more investment in like kind of new idea generation, like in the vein of Minecraft?
For a while, the industry mantra was fewer, bigger bets, and the idea is you just have to put more. I guess the analogy from outside the industry would be a little bit about what Hollywood did in the last 5 or 10 years about franchises like the Marvel franchise and Star Wars franchise, were sort of dramatic drama movies sort of went away, and they focused on Marvel films. I think there's been something going on in the games industry for a long time. Another analogy, or sort of mixed metaphors, is if everybody's read the book Moneyball and or seen the movie or both, and people like to think it's about stats and about using stats on things and intelligent use of stats. What I really took away from both the book and the movie is you could be looking at one set of facts, but those aren't the facts that matter. You should be looking at something different. So the aha of that lesson was, it's not RBIs at all. RBIs don't win games, but getting people on base is actually what ends up winning games. And that was the insight. So if you're just focused on, if you grow up and everybody you know, every single person you know is focused on RBIs, you're probably going to get the lesson that RBIs are what matter. And I think everybody I know in the games industry, at least in AAA, thinks, we'll say cinematic graphics and sound, or they'll focus on high-end graphics and so on. And it's not to say that those things don't matter, but they're just one of the tools in your box to make something really cool. And I think a lot of people miss that lesson, and they miss the sort of the forest for the trees. But now, when now I see a lot. I think the industry is at a bit of a crisis point, so we may have a reexamination of some of those issues.
Yeah, I think part of what we're trying to do at Stash, and part of my strong thesis on games, I come from an investment background, and unfortunately, I would often be working with those studios, and they would, it's a trade-off. Do you make a really high-polished vertical slice or something that actually proves an interesting system and gameplay? Unfortunately, to get the investment, you probably need to make the highly polished vertical slice, because that's what the funding, if that's what funders are looking for, if that's what public shareholders are looking for, that's the kind of CDO they're going to hire, that's the startup they'll fund. And I think it's like a vicious cycle. But part of what we're trying to do at Stash is refocus the innovative minds of the industry on distribution strategy and like release strategy as a component of product innovation. And I would argue, I probably have like a dogmatic theory on this, but every game that has come out and been like an innovative entry to the market, so including Minecraft, but also League, Fortnite, Roblox, has, yes, had some interesting and great content, but they've also done something very differently in terms of how they released their games. Even Baldur's Gate 3 released into early access in an extraordinarily unique way, used that funding to compete with some of the big guys. And I truly believe that like we have reached a point where making a better version of your product and releasing it in exactly the same way is basically not growing the market. And I think you could prove this looking at 2023, where arguably it was the best year for game releases ever. Baldur's Gate 3, God of War 2, Spider-Man, Tears of the Kingdom, etc. And yet, according to Newzoo, the console numbers only grew by 0.3%. So like, what does that tell you about the impact that had? The things that are growing this category, and I think breaking out, are those that take really novel approaches to like how they treat their games as product, and especially how they get those products to players.
Yeah, I would agree with everything. I think the people that I know who are most eloquent at talking about that are certainly Mitch Lasky is at the top of that list. He and I have had a lot of discussions over the years on that exact topic. There are, and I would agree with it. What you just said, 1,000%. That's exactly spot on as far as I'm concerned. I think there is a very strong case to be made that I hear on the other side, which is, look, it's really just hard to sell a commodity. Why pretend that something that is a copycat product is not a commodity? And commodity means low margins, and yet we have high cost structures in the games business. So, I originally came out of sales. Trying to sell something that looks like everything else is a real hard topic. And so, when I talk to I'm not sure that the industry is really even going down that road in a very significant way, at least in large numbers. Every once in a while, you'll meet a Brandon and Mark from Riot who have a very particular view about how to market the product, is almost part of the product thesis and their whole company thesis, which is really smart. You could argue that things like Minecraft were a bit of a luck of timing, because they sort of grew at the same time as YouTube. Those types of effects do happen. I do agree that the company that figures this out is gonna be a very serious company to contend with. But I think you could also make a very good argument that you think you got a marketing problem, but you got a product problem. And where I net on this is, or both are true. And,
yes.
And the idea that you're just going to say, well, if I build it, they will come is probably pretty naive. I meet a lot of people like that. But at the same time, in any situation, selling something that is a commodity is going to be super hard, especially in the games business.
But I think what you raise is a valid argument. However, I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what you are selling in games if you think you can divorce the distribution strategy from the product. Like for example, a licensing, where you would have thought that was a skin wrapper layer. Like, no, it is actually better to play the fantasy of being the football team manager for the team you love, with the players you love, than it is to play with this anonymized. I remember Royal Blue was like the Chelsea game. And so similarly, like, is esports like a marketing strategy for League of Legends, or is it part of the products they're selling at League of Legends? And I think that the best games understand that how players play the game is part of the player experience and part of the product to some extent.
No, I would agree with that. I'd agree with all that. That's certainly been true in my experience. Yeah.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about your time at Nexon and the next step in your career, which is, you joined as CFO and then went through the IPO and ended up being CEO for 14 years. I'm curious what it's like, what it was like being a Westerner and taking over a, East Asian, Japanese, and Korean company.
Yeah. So I joined Nexon in 2010. I became CEO in 2014 and just retired in March of this year. So it was exactly 10 years as CEO. Nexon was this gem of a company and still is, and a lot bigger. But when I was nobody really knew it at the time that I joined. When I was at EA, I had tried to buy Nexon 3 times. First, right after I joined in 2000, then about halfway through my time at EA around 2006, right after we had purchased Gemdet, and then again right before I left in 2009. In each of those times, I had known Jay Kim, the founder, from before, in going way back to my Pointcast days at the early parts of the internet. But you have to understand how interesting Korea was in the international world at that time. When all of us were doing dial-up 56K modems at the early stages of the internet in the early to mid 90s, in around 1993, you could get a megabit downstream internet connection for $20 US in those days. So that was like super cheap, super fast. I mean, Seoul was essentially one giant LAN, 20 million people, and there were the two biggest telcos were battling each other to the death to try to wire everybody up with broadband. And it was because of course it's very sticky. So once you get one, you're not going to change to the other very quickly. So there was this wonderful generation, that we sort of joked as the greatest generation of game companies that were born at that time. There were a bunch of really good tech and game companies, but it was really the game companies. And Jay Kim and Jake Song and, and a bunch of other really smart people really were they were going to really good technical colleges and really good universities, Seoul National and KAIST in particular. And, but they wanted to do the internet stuff. And in the case of Jay, the founder of Nexon, the rumor was that he and TJ both got kicked out of Seoul National for starting their game companies respectively. And so, you didn't drop out in those days. You got kicked out for doing that. But their games didn't look like games, but they were online. And the first online MMORPG was called Kingdom of the Winds by Nexon, by a developer named Jake Song. Jake shortly thereafter left and went to NCSoft and make Lineage. And so these are the two longest. This is before World of Warcraft and before even Ultima Online. And so that's the history, and I kind of got to know them. But when I first joined EA, EA really knew that the internet was going to change the industry. This is in 2000. They were organized around a packaged goods business. They didn't quite know how it was going to happen. It was like newspapers didn't in those days really know how the internet was going to change their business. They just knew that the storm clouds were coming. And they were very ambitious about Asia as well, because we never really conquered Asia. And since I was the only one who spoke an Asian language and I was doing corp dev, and I had at least as much internet experience as anybody in the company at that time, I sort of went off to Asia and toured a bunch of Korean game companies and sort of fell in love. I mean, it was an embarrassment of riches of companies that did exactly what we were aspiring to do at EA at the time. And I wrote this memo to the exec team. Remember, I'm a new guy. I was only a few months in. And it was, I've seen the future of video games, and it is Nexon. And I got basically laughed out of the room. They all thought I was ridiculous. Well, one of the things they said was, these don't look like games. Like, they're pixelated 2D experiences that look like an early version of Mario. And we're going to come in with our high fidelity graphics, and nobody's going to play these games anymore. And it didn't turn out to be the case. It was a very understandable reaction, to the person with a hammer. Everything looks like a male, and graphics
they were like cinematic graphics and sound.
Cinematic graphics and sound. Like, literally, that was the argument. And again, it wasn't that they were dumb. It was just that we were very focused on how to win in the way that we knew how to win. But the Korean game companies were just phenomenal, and they were so aggressive and so fast, and so they had all these crazy ideas like, hey, let's make a Tetris game. Then instead of being single player, let's make it dual Tetris. And like, you've got falling blocks and I've got falling blocks, but then maybe I get a power up so I can shove over my falling block to you. So now you got to deal with 2 falling blocks, and maybe, and so you have all these different ideas. It turns out they weren't able to get the license because they were pretty naive about licensing stuff in those days. But that was really interesting. And I just really loved this company from my entire time at EA. And, finally, after 3 generations of, hey, Jay, I'd like to buy your company, and him saying, why don't you come over to work for us instead? Finally, by the 4th time, it was sort of like time to go. But Nexon at the time was a really interesting case study. It was 17 years private, perfectly happy to stay private for the rest of its, fortunes or for the rest of its life. But we realized we really wanted to do some M&A, and we wanted to be of higher scale. So we did the IPO. It had moved its headquarters to Japan, and it was, which was a very unusual move. And then I came in as CFO to take the company public. And again, I was the only person who had really had any public company experience. But it was a very interesting time. We went out the same week that Zynga did. And we were on the road show. We were 4 days ahead of them. And my former colleague from EA, John Schappert, was the COO at the time, and Dave Wayner was their CFO. And every once in a while, we compare notes. But we were two very, very, very different. We couldn't be more different companies, but it looked at the surface like we were very similar. So it was a very interesting time to be doing an IPO.
So, and you're glossing over a little bit of a secret flex of yours that you speak Japanese. Is that part of the reason why they recruited you to take this thing global? What was were you one of a recruit? What was the backstory of that?
Yeah, I mean, we were going to be a public Japanese company, and I spoke Japanese. So I had this sort of weird background where I had learned Japanese in college, and so, I like games, so I was sort of what they needed at the time. And I had worked at EA, and the other weird confluence of coincidences was I had worked at EA, and I'd worked for the CFO of EA at the time, wanted me to take over IR, and I didn't want to take over IR, but he would drag me into all these meetings, and I got trained basically by someone who was very, very good. So it worked out okay later.
IR for the audience is investor relationships, so it's dealing with all your shareholders who are technically your bosses.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about your EA? Because you mentioned one of the reasons that you were an interesting pick for Nexon as CFO is because they wanted to do some M&A. So were you quite involved with EA's M&A strategy in the period you were there?
Yeah, I ran it. I ran M&A. That was my main job, was M&A and strategy for between 2000 and 2009. Yeah.
Can you maybe talk a bit about, because under your tenure, right, EA bought companies like BioWare, Criterion, Jamdad, as you mentioned, had a fascinating list of acquisitions. And, that strategy has become very common in the games industry, almost to the point where there are no M&A targets. I'm just interested to get your impressions on what that was like, any kind of good stories, bad stories, learnings from your period acquiring these businesses, especially I think at a time when games were becoming probably more professionalized. So bringing BioWare into a public org, I'd be really curious how that went.
Yeah, I mean, BioWare was sort of at the tail end of when I was there, and it was when you're doing M&A, there's some things where you're the chef, and there's some where you're the short order cook. And somebody really needs something, and you help them buy it, and you're sort of the internal banker for them. I think the one that there were 2 that were really interesting that were not sort of let's buy them and wrap them in and make them part of the machine. One was Jamdad, which was run by Mitch Lasky, and that started out by Mitch and I had worked on trying to do a deal earlier where he would license some IP from us, and we were going to own a percentage of the company. That didn't end up happening. We got swooped by someone else on that. But Mitch and I had stayed in contact. But by a couple of years later, we really realized, or at least I was very much a believer, that mobile was coming, and we needed to be really smart about it. And the smartest people on the planet by far were the Jamdad team. And I thought Mitch was one of the most impressive executives I'd ever seen, and he should be part of the executive team. And so we were catching up for lunch, and he was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about coming out and working for Jamdad?" And my recollection of the story, Mitch might tell you a different story, but I was sort of had well, I wouldn't want to buy you. Why would I want to go work for you? And he kind of took umbrage on that comment and gave me a bunch of good feedback, as only Mitch can. And I was so impressed by his response to that. I said, well, maybe I would want to buy you. So, why don't we start talking about that? And then proceeded one of the hardest negotiations, actually the hardest negotiation I ever had in my life, because he's a real tire in the negotiating room. But it worked out really well for us, at least in the near term. The other one that was really interesting for us was DICE. And it was interesting because it had so many aspects of what we're talking about here. They had just come out with the beta for Battlefield 1942, which was on the surface looked a lot like a Medal of Honor or like the first version of Call of Duty. So it looked like this. So on the surface, it looked like a World War II first-person shooter that happened to have some vehicles in it. And I can tell you, we made an original minority investment in them and had a publishing deal attached to it that was very favorable to both parties. It took us a long time to architect it, but it really worked well. My intention at the time was I wanted to see if I could get Patrick Soderlund in as part of the studio, and because I thought he was very smart and his team was very good and his product was differentiated. I can tell you that there was huge debate internally, and it was sort of over a couple of dead bodies where we ended up making that original investment. It may, by my rough math, as far as I haven't been there in a long time, but I think it was one of the best acquisitions they ever did on a returns basis. We ended up buying the company 3 years later, and Patrick, sort of ended up running the studio and very successfully until 2018. Battlefield became a huge franchise for them. The time he left, I think it was, well, I don't want to speak for them, but it was a very large portion of their revenue. And so it was but the interesting lesson on that was the objection that people had was, we have a World War II franchise, why do we need another? Which was a reasonable thing to say. What they didn't see was that it was a truly online game. You couldn't play the game offline at all. And it was a vehicular first-person shooter. So you could get in, you could get in the submarine and run the submarine. You could get in the airplane and bomb from above. It was just and it was also an insanely fun game. So if you just look at like fun and different, it's in the upper right-hand quadrant of that graphic. And going back to this debate of like, is it distribution? Is it product? On that spectrum, this would be a great argument for how a game could really break out in a very difficult environment by being fun and different, which most games are not. They're either not different or they're not fun or both. So 99% of the pitches that I look at a year are not differentiated at all. This one was very different, but our company had a hard time getting its head around that. But all I knew was that me and my friends could not stop playing this game, and there was nothing like it in the market, and it was just insanely fun, and the team is really good. So those are a couple. I think one of the other things is you have to think about the games business is not like aircraft engines or, auto parts or something like that. They're not factories. They are groups of people. And in all the M&A mistakes that either I've made, which have been many, or that I've seen around the industry, because of people incompatibility and cultural incompatibility. So going back to, Nexon, one of the things I really liked about Nexon was, although I came as a kid who was raised in Northern California, I was very different culturally from my colleagues at Nexon. Actually, business-wise, we were exactly the same culture. We had the same view about short-term versus long-term and about what really mattered in games and why we're here and all that sort of stuff. So we could communicate across these vast cultural and linguistic gulfs. But most times when you're doing M&A, you forget about that entirely. And it's kind of okay in other things, but this is one of the reasons why nobody's ever done a successful roll-up in the games industry. Everybody who comes in from the outside says, let's roll up the industry. And there's a million private equity people there who still to this day are talking about doing roll-ups in the games industry. As you've probably seen, it doesn't work. I can tell you it doesn't work. And it falls down on this one issue of people and what drives them. It's like trying to roll up the architecture industry. It's just a group of people or law firms or something.
Yeah, I think also one of the flip side of that is when you have culture fit acquisition, it can be like highly accretive and valuable. I mean, even within the scope of the EA, it sounds like I think Patrick Soderlund was like valuable to the broader organization in the same way I think probably the Respawn acquisition was later, that they bring.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the best acquisitions they did was bringing Vince Zampella, and it was a fabulous deal for them on multiple different levels, that being one of them. I would absolutely agree with what you're saying.
Awesome. Just being conscious of time, I think we should move on to like more deep. I feel like we've been building up for a time at Nexon, and now we can finally get to it. So I would love to know just where you joined an IPO, you helped them IPO very successfully, and then where was Nexon as a business when you stepped into the number one job?
Let's see. We were a lot smaller when I started out. The IPO we raised about $1.2 billion, but we had two really great franchises and a number of others as well. But we were terribly misunderstood, and that was the heavy lifting of the IPO, and was the heavy lifting during every quarterly call I had since the IPO. And I think the industry still misunderstands it. But MapleStory came out, it's now I think 21 years in. Dungeon Fighter is about 19 years in. These games on the surface look old, and the mental model of the games industry is product life cycle, what they call PLC in Asia, right? A game goes up and then it goes down and it never comes back. And it creates all sorts of problems for investors to understand your business. If you think a game goes up and then down, you're going to value the company based off of essentially a tangent on the curve of wherever it happens to be at that time. And if it's on the upswing, then you think it's going to the moon and it's going to keep going up. And if it's on the downswing, you just assume it never comes back. And Nexon is one of a very small number of companies that are proven over a period of 2 decades, or more, that that's just not the case. And that's a serious it's almost like a bromide in the industry. So Nexon was quite a bit smaller, and we struggled with the same thing that everybody else did, but we recognized, at least around that time, that we really understand what we call deeply immersive, some people call hardcore online games. All we've ever done really well is online games that are deeply immersive. So let's just do that. So we, over the years, we got out of the mobile games business, particularly casual mobile. We got out of Facebook games. We had the first esports center in the world, Nexon Arena in Gangnam, 550 seats, 300 events per year. But we really kind of got out of esports as where we were spending money. We ended up not being big believers in that. But our ideas were, we're going to focus on this area of making these games, last and grow forever. We call them forever franchises. And I would say that's probably the biggest lesson in the last 10 years, and almost nobody has really taken that to heart. People talk a good game, but they haven't really been able to do what's required to get there. And what's required to get there starts at the operating level and goes all the way up to the CEO, and how the CEO communicates with his or her shareholders.
Yeah, I actually think it's worth just like for the audience, like I don't think people in the West don't appreciate just how much of a behemoth Nexon is now. I think probably a lot of Western consumers were educated about Nexon from Dave the Diver, which, very controversially, this shadowy Korean corporation was making one of the top indie games of the year, was the narrative. But just for reference, I think, based on your investor calls, so you might check my math on this, I think only like 5 to 10% of Nexon's revenue comes from Europe and America combined. Dungeon Online has made over $22 billion over the course of its lifetime. It still makes north of $1 billion a year from digital sales. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that is just enormous for a game that's over 20 years old.
Yeah. I mean, your numbers, if anything, are a little bit old. I can't remember exactly what the IR department, and I can't speak for the company now. I can only, rewind to 9 months ago when I was last CEO. I think the number for DNF is $28 billion in life-to-date revenue. And at the time that I was there, but the IR team might take issue with this, or maybe we should check this. Let's call it 22, as you said before, but I'm pretty sure they've announced that it's over that.
Is that the whole franchise or the online game?
It's the online game.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. So, but they're adding more to it, and now there's a new mobile version that's coming out that's launched very successfully. I think the scale is huge, and what it really points to, though, more than anything, is longevity. And the games can keep on growing forever. And if you do that well, you've just got an incredibly substantial business. Again, when I left Nexon, we were about a $23 billion market cap. We were 22, 23. We generate $3 billion or so a year, about $1 billion in operating income. So you have this very substantial business. But the good news is, unlike the traditional games business,
It's not like movies where you have to like put out a new product to make more revenue. You know, you have to replace old revenue with new. It can stack, and that's a great business. And but you have to make some real decisions about how you operate your company. You have to work off a different set of metrics, and that I don't think is well understood.
Yeah, I think another analogy might be like, you shouldn't be focusing on being like, I don't know, Paramount. You should think about how can you be Netflix, right? Where it's still a content business, but it's content fundamentally operated as like a long-term business. But we even benefit from the fact that you don't even need to keep making series.
Yeah, you know, it comes down to like, do you want to sleep well at night? I mean, it was a very practical problem for me as CEO. I didn't, you know, I looked at some of the mobile companies and I would look at their lifetimes, right? Like we would do the M&A analysis and I'd be like, okay, how long do you retain a customer? First problem, oftentimes they didn't really track it that well. Second of all, they would often track it wrong, like when they calculated their lifetime value calculations, or they even tracked lifetimes or retention numbers. They just did it wrong. But third and biggest was they were just short. They just couldn't hang on to a customer well. And to me, you know, if I've got a bucket and it's supposed to hold water, I want it to have as few leaks as possible. So if I acquire a new customer, I want to put drops of water at the top of the bucket, and I don't want it to all fall off the bottom. And some of these are sort of more like, they're not buckets, they're not even funnels, they're more like pipes, you know, where they just like it all falls through after a period of days or weeks. And that was one of the things that we realized about a lot of the mobile companies that we could buy or the mobile game that we could play would have high customer acquisition costs, low lifetime values. You would have very tight tolerances between these, which translates to very thin margins. That's even if you're doing it well. And we just didn't think we were good enough to do it. We were a company that was built off of, you know, low customer acquisition costs and very, very high lifetime values. And we like that business a lot. We just wanted to keep doing that for the rest of our lives. So that's a good business. And you can do that very, very cost effectively too.
Mobile is much more suited to like venture style, I think, innovation and growth. I mean, I always point to the fact there's very few precedents of a venture exit for a PC console studio. Whereas on mobile, the nice thing about it is if you have a good enough game with the economics work and you have the capital, you can scale that pretty reliably. So, you know, it's very hard to build a $10 billion, sorry?
You can scale the revenue.
You can scale the revenue, true. And then a publicly traded PC studio can buy it and use it for like, you know, multiple arbitrage. But
yeah, I would respectfully submit that unless you can hang on to your customer, that game is over. Why? It's over for two reasons. Number one is we're probably past the point of zero interest rates where the venture capital folks are, you know, you can basically buy stuff you can fund that from very low interest rates. So the funding environment may dry up. I think the acquirers that I talk to at least are like, why do that, right? Like once you get into a public company, you know, if I can't hang on to my customers, it's going to go to zero anyway. I will have just torched money for doing that. And then the third, of course, is you got all the IDFA stuff that's going on, which make the economics even a lot harder. So I would argue that probably the sale of Zynga to Take-Two was very well timed. I certainly think Take-Two is happy with how it's worked out so far. I think they've got a very good management team there, but I'm not sure it would be that easy to be an independent public company or even make that sale today. But yeah. I could be wrong about that.
No, I agree with you. I think mobile will build you $1 billion exit maybe, but not much more than that because your revenue is not as valuable, you know, and they trade at lower multiples for that reason. But I think that, you know, they've proved beneficial to some of the PC guys that have bought some of these at better valuations than Zynga's, which I agree was an unfortunately timed acquisition for for Take-Two.
Well, it certainly worked out well for, you know, in the acquisition of King for Activision, for example. But why has that happened? Because everybody on both sides was shocked by the longevity of Candy Crush. That looks actually like a PC online game in a lot of ways. And so, what I heard from the outside, and I, you know, from them, and you know, but you know, who knows what was spin, was that they thought they would have a lot more stuff in the pipeline, but what really paid out was Candy Crush. So, to me, I would, you know, kind of submit that sort of proves the point is that longevity is really what. Yeah, I
agree. I think maybe where I disagree with you is I think mobile games can be surprisingly long. I worked with Dream at VCO.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you've seen this on the Hasbro side with Monopoly Go, and that's turned out to surprise, I think, the people who are the developers and a lot of people in the industry. It's a very happy surprise for sure.
Well, we got to wrap in a second, I know. So maybe we could just ask one final question, which is kind of about the stuff we were talking about earlier with AAA games and AAA being broken. We saw you say that in a fireside chat at the Game Awards. Tell us, what do you think the future is for AAA?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that I was making, this is about a year ago, I guess it was Game Awards exactly 1 year ago. The point I was making was that nobody was really happy in the games industry. I heard back from some friends who heard that fireside chat that, Owen, you sound kind of unhappy. And I'm like, I'm happy. I've been having a great run, so I'm super happy. But I think most of the people that I talk to are unhappy. And so go down the list, customers. I know a lot of game customers, and I'm one of them. I'm a consumer. Would like to see more innovative games that really speak to them as gamers and do interesting and cool stuff. We all love Minecraft for a reason. That's a good example, but there are several others. Look at what Zeekers did with Lethal Company. Really great new game, came out of nowhere. We'd love to see a lot more of that in the games industry, but for the most part, there wasn't that much of that. People, game companies trying new stuff. So you go, well, why aren't game companies do that? Well, are the developers not on it? Do they not? Well, I would submit that developers they're actually unhappy as well, in large part. Like, you're a developer, you're really talented, you've got amazing capabilities to be able to make a AAA game, but you end up getting essentially asked to work in a factory. That's not so fun, for those people. It's really a hard job, and it's not that great. And the factory is, you're going to take this sort of same idea and you're going to do it over and over again. A lot of people don't really like that. Well, who's the bad guy then? Is the management team that makes them do that? Well, I can tell you, having been on, executive teams of big game companies for a long time, it's a pretty hard job to make your company grow. And, for all the reasons about economics that we've been talking about, you're in a pretty tough situation. Well, you can then blame your shareholders for forcing your hand on this stuff, but I can tell you a lot of unhappy shareholders in the games industry right now, all of which is a danger. You don't want to have unhappy customers in your industry. You certainly don't want to have unhappy developers. You want to have unhappy managers, because then they go to some other industry. You definitely don't want to have unhappy investors either, because they'll abandon ship and go to some other industry, which is a higher and better use. I think that was very true then, and not a lot of people were saying that, or didn't seem to be saying that then. The industry's evolved a little bit. One thing is, I read, you guys may know better than me, that we've had 40,000 layoffs this year in the games industry globally, which is kind of an apocalypse. But I think it speaks to some of the underlying problems that we've had, both on the development side and on the marketing side and distribution side that we've been talking about. What I think gives me a lot of hope is that there's more people who are understanding that this is an issue, and that from funding sources on down, and by funding sources, I mean venture capital and game companies, although it may not come as quickly from public game companies, that we can change this. And we don't have to accept the status quo. We can call into question some of these sort of fundamental issues that affect our industry. Like, for example, on the marketing side, marketing distribution side, we can call into question about, spending money on state-of-the-art graphics when that's not really what makes us gamers happy long term. We can sort of reconfigure the industry in a new and different way. It usually takes pressure and crisis to do that, but I do sense when I talk to people around the industry that we're getting a lot closer to that now. And there's much more of a consensus forming. I think some people looked at me a little cross-eyed last year. I think they'll do that this year.
Awesome. Well, Owen, thanks so much for joining us. This is a really insightful conversation, and appreciate your time. I know you got to run, so we'll wrap there.
Great questions. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a million.
Thanks so much, Aaron.